and she's distraught, disappointed, and on the brink of quitting her entire weight loss journey.
Breaking decades worth of bad habits. And that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen over a couple of months. It's a process.
Welcome to your daily health briefing. I'm Dr. Albert Tackett. This show is here to help you navigate the complex U.S. medical system, one step at a time. Whether you are decoding a new diagnosis, fighting for a referral, or just trying to stay informed, you are in the right place. Let's get into the science. Manuela comes to the clinic worried. She has been doing everything she can by her own telling. She has been taking sabotage 15 milligrams and comes in today having gained 3 pounds, and she's distraught, disappointed, and on the brink of quitting her entire weight loss journey. This is the situation for Manuela, but for many patients we see in the clinic every day. So I brought today my esteemed colleague and obesity and primary care specialist, Dr. Khan, to delve into this subject of why some patients fail on Ozempic and other GLP-1 medications. So Dr. Khan, what's the problem with Manuela?
Man, thank you for having me. Absolutely. So this is a loaded question because there's a lot that goes into it. As I'm sure all of us have said before, there's no magic pill out there, but it also depends on other factors like, your mental health. Where are you in terms of your commitment to everything, right? Your consistency with everything. The medication can do a lot and it can help you a lot, but it also requires some sacrifices. As I always say, in life, anything that's worth having requires a lot of struggle. Otherwise we all have a six-pack. We all be very, very multi-million. It takes time to get to that
Everybody
level.
will be Bill Gates.
Yeah, everybody will be Bill Gates if that was easy, right? But it's not. That's where there's always a few of those. And so just like that, weight loss requires that kind of commitment, lifestyle changes, which aren't always easy because of life. There's things always happening and work is always work. And then you got the kids and somebody got sick or you got into a fight with your partner or, there's always these things in life that are going on. And the key is to be consistent throughout that and learning to do that. And that's what the journey is all about, is making these changes, not all at once, but building on them. Small changes you can make and get to the goal that you want to one day.
So now that's very interesting because the counter that patients always ask me is, if the science is solid that the medicines work, then why am I not losing weight? For instance, Manuela. And so this is the part of the story where we can dive a little bit deeper into the science.
Absolutely.
Because I pointed out to her that there are differences in GLP-1 receptors in people, genetic differences, environmental differences, lifestyle. Can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me start by giving you an example. So I had a patient just about a week ago, and she told me her opening line in this discussion was, hey, I only eat one meal a day, yet I gained 10 pounds. And she was also on, I think, phentermine, a different sort of a weight loss medication. And it turned, so when she said that, it really struck me, and I really wanted to dive into her day-to-day to really figure out what's really going on here. And long story short, it turns out every morning she has 2 drinks from Starbucks. And those 2 drinks, in this her specific order, she showed me on her phone, and we're going through it, right? So I open up a nutrition app, and I plug in the drink that she likes to drink. It's not food she's not eating. She eats once a day, but this specific 2 drinks have 40 grams of sugar each, so 80 grams of sugar. And I wanted her to really understand, because when we say 40 grams of sugar and 50, 60 grams of sugar, this, that, most people don't understand how much that could be, right? And so I made it very simple. I calculated it out for her, and turns out every month she was eating about 5 pounds of sugar. And in a year of doing this, which most people do, you see the line outside of these places. Yeah, they're very consistent. People are consistent with that. And so you're eating close to 50 to 60 pounds of sugar per year on just coffee.
60 pounds of sugar.
do the math. Yes, it's very easy nowadays.
Wow.
Your Chat GPTs and your Google, they'll you just give them the number, they'll calculate it for you. You don't even have to do the math, and you'll see how much sugar it is you're putting in your body. And then you're expecting weight loss from, whatever medication you might be on, but there's no magic pill. It requires specific things. It requires that commitment. And so my point here being, so in terms of your question, factors like your diet really matter. How strictly am I calculating my daily caloric intake? And then you don't just stop at that, but what is the composition of that diet, right? So how much is carbs, and how much is fat? How much is protein? And then can you really figure out what I need to be doing, So this kind of stuff requires data and patience and time, right? And it's different for each person. So like you mentioned, some people genetically may not have the receptors, and for some people who may not understand what we're talking about, when you take a medication, it has to connect somewhere. So this is sort of that puzzle piece that medication connects to and then allows it to do what it wants to do. And so if this individual doesn't have that connection available, a lot of them, then the medication won't work as well for that individual. So that's a big factor. Sometimes hormones and other medical issues like PCOS, or you have a thyroid problem, other medical issues can sometimes impact it even more.
Which explains why some patients say, Doc, I took the medicine and I didn't feel any difference in my appetite.
Yeah. And that's a very common complaint. And sometimes we play around with the medications. We might switch them to another one if possible. But again, long story short, though, these are few instances. Most people who take the medication do respond to it in a very positive way.
But a lot of times, as you mentioned, I think there is also a strong component of expectations. Some patients, and I've had patients who assume that I'll just take the medicine and I will just keep eating the way I eat.
That's a very common thing as well, because, and what tricks people into that is that sometimes, because again, these medications are so effective, you may not change anything in your life. And in the first 2 to 3 months, you might lose 20, 25 pounds. And during that 2-3 months, now that's building your expectation. You're seeing the results. You're like, I'm taking the medication on time, whatever, but nothing else in your life has changed. And so what I've seen in my experience over the last 4 or 5 years with patients is that, yeah, sure, sometimes you might get that initial chunk of weight loss, but then it's going to taper out and it's going to slow down dramatically. And then all of a sudden, instead of 5 pounds a month, 6 pounds a month that you were averaging for the first 3 or 4 months, it's suddenly dropped to 1 or 2 or nothing. And then comes in the frustration, and then comes in something like your patient said, I want to give up, like this is useless, that kind of thing. But again, like we said, anything in life that's worth pursuing, it requires consistency and determination. And so you have to make some of these changes.
So sometimes habits trump the medications.
Absolutely.
Effect.
And that's sort of what I meant when I said sometimes mental health. Like you have to, it'd be in a space where you're ready to make these kinds of changes, because it may not be easy. You're talking about breaking decades worth of bad habits, and that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen over a couple of months. It's a process. And so sometimes, yes, people go into these medications expecting a lot in a short period of time, because in today's day and age, we don't have the patience that we once used to. Everything's instant. Everything, Google gives you an instant answer. You tap your credit card, instant purchase. Online, you can quickly do whatever you want.
A 30-second delay is a major crisis right now.
So exactly. So we've been sort of trained to expect this kind of stuff subconsciously, but again, it requires time. If you go to college, it takes 4 years. You don't just do it in one. And so
medical school.
There you go. Yeah,
and being a doctor, 12 years.
There you
minimum.
go. Minimum.
Entry level.
Exactly. At the bottom of the pyramid.
Primary care, 12 years.
Yeah. So, but again, how hard it was. The struggles you went through, but you remain consistent, and that's why you are where you are today, and and the success you've had in your practice. And so, just like that in life, you have to work hard for things that you really want to achieve.
Same goes for weight loss.
Absolutely, no different.
Okay. So if we can leave patients today with 2 parting action items, what would those be?
So, I'd reiterate, number 1, don't be afraid of the medication. Don't fall into the myths or anything like that. Talk to your doctor about whether it's an appropriate medication for your goals or your medical conditions.
Individual variability can exist.
Absolutely. And then when you go into this, again, you have to be committed. Of course, the medication would really help you, but what really is the long-term solution is going to be those changes you make in your day-to-day, those choices you make when you're not thinking, the quick breakfast you pick up in the morning, or the coffee you drink, and the small things on a day-to-day that matter. So biggest thing is, make up your mind and be determined, and then trust the process.
Consistency.
Yes, sir.
Like everything else.
Absolutely.
All right, Dr. Khan, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
This has been the Daily Brief. Medicine is not about certainty. It is about responsibility. Decisions are often made with incomplete information, but they are always made with your safety in mind. In a system that can feel rushed and fragmented, you deserve clarity, continuity, and an advocate who sees the whole picture. I am Dr. Albert Taken, your physician ally, high-level science, human-level care. I will see you at the next briefing, or I will see you in the clinic.